Emma, your time has come.
No, wait, I haven't scanned my receipts.
What?
You know, on Fetch Rewards, you can scan and read receipt, like this one, and you redeem the points, and then you can spend them all from your mobile device in a matter of seconds.
Wait, rewards for receipts? This is a hoax.
No, really, you can even scan your Amazon purchases. Look.
Whoa, this is amazing.
Yeah, no worries. And if you use code Mortis, you get 3,000 points when you scan your first receipts.
Thanks.
My two friends and I were hiking in a pretty popular spot in our area. It's an 150-foot waterfall that takes about 45 minutes of uphill hiking to get to. We decided to go bouldering around the bottom of the waterfall. There are various little pools and boulders where the water runs off from the waterfall. This bouldering trail is not on the main trail, and not many hikers ever veer off the main trail. We found someone while on the trail. A 22-year-old girl, face down in the mud, both legs broken with compound fractures. She had no cell phone, no water, and nothing to keep her warm. Her friend didn't make it. When we found her, we obviously called 911 and gave her any supplies we had. Eventually, a helicopter showed up, and they flew her to the nearest hospital. Turns out she was hiking with her friend the night before when they both fell off the waterfall. Her friend must have gone to get help, but unfortunately died less than 100 yards from where we found the girl. So no one knew she was hurt, or that she was even there. It's a miracle she was still alive, and mind-blowing to think what she had gone through when we found her 20 hours later. One time my friend and I went into the woods at night and kept hearing something call our name. I turned around for a second and my friend was gone. I looked for him everywhere but couldn't find him. I called his phone, but of course there was no cell service. Then I heard him call my name. So I followed his voice and I came upon a cliff, and my friend was nowhere to be found. I decided to go home and see if he was there and go to ask for help. But when I got there, he was playing video games in the living room. I was a bit upset, because I was in the woods the whole time looking for him, and he was at home playing video games. But when I confronted him about this, he gave me this confused look and told me he'd never left the house, as if he'd never gone to the woods with me at all. He said he'd seen me walk out the door, and when he called my name, I completely ignored him, though I don't remember that happening. Till this day, I have no clue what happened. I was camping with a bunch of city dwellers who had never done a hiking camp trip before. Needless to say, some things didn't go so well, like two people only bringing one small water bottle, several people bringing insufficient food, and one couple that were carrying an 8-man tent between them. It was like herding cats, let me tell you that. Anyway, we finally make it to camp, maybe 2:30. We're up in the cliffs and have a beautiful view. We have ample time to set up camp, cook dinner, and tell ghost stories, etc. But no, these numbnuts get the bright idea to go down to the water. "It's just right there," they plead. 30 minutes tops. It's easily a 2-hour hike down. I know this. One other guy knows this, but we feel obligated to go with these yahoos to keep them out of trouble. We get to the beach while the sun is setting, and now we have to hike back in the deepening darkness. There's a dim moon and the fog is rolling in. I have the only flashlight, and the batteries give out after a while. Of course we get lost, and I manage to take a spill, twisting my ankle pretty badly. So it's dark, fog has visibility down further, and we're lost, cold, and hungry, and I'm injured. Then the other competent hiker pulls me aside and tells me in hushed, urgent tones, I don't want to freak the others out, but there is something following us back there. It comes into view and then fades back into the fog, and I've never seen anything like it. As we continue, I catch a ghostly white shape in my vision. Maybe 3 feet tall, moving silently but quickly alongside the trail we're on. Every hair on my body stood on end, and I could make a diamond in my arse. It didn't stay visible for long, and disappeared into the brush almost as soon as I noticed it. I caught fleeting sight of it twice again, before it disappeared for good. To this day I have no idea what it was. I never saw it for long enough or clearly enough to make even an educated guess. It didn't move like any animal I'm familiar with or am aware of in that park. I can't tell you how relieved I was when we got above the fog, and the visibility, though still darker than Satan's butthole, while illuminated by a sickly candle, quadrupled. At midnight we called for a halt. We rested for about half hour, pulled what little food and water we had left, and tried to figure out where we were. When we got started up again, it literally took 10 steps and turn a bend, and we were straight into our tents. We still tell stories about how delicious the crunchy spaghetti was that I made for everyone, one bowl at a time that night. Honestly, I was making it so I would have an excuse to stand next to the fire, hoping that whatever was out there would be afraid of it. Later that morning, I was woken up by something underneath the tent pushing hard into my back. I believe I screamed and scrambled out of my sleeping bag and out the tent without ever passing through the space between those 2 points. I peered back into the tent and I could see my sleeping bag jumping up in a rhythmic motion. I landed on the mound with my elbows and proceeded to punch the ever-living crap out of it. When the sleep/grogginess dissipated, I assumed it was a gopher, but I was taking 0 chances after that misadventure. So I like to explore abandoned places. Me and a friend were walking through the woods of Virginia to find an old mine shaft. It was about 8 p.m. last Saturday. So as we were walking, all the animals would go completely silent at random, and shortly after we would find a bunch of flat stones stacked up on top of each other, along with branches cracking and rustling in the woods. This happened about 4 times. Further in the woods it became completely silent and stayed that way. So during this walk, we were looking around when my friend spots these red eyes in the distance about group height. We stopped a bit and just stared at it until we got bored and continued our walk. We soon spotted them again, but this time waist height, and we ignored it and continued. Once again we came across the eyes, but this time they were closer and about 5 foot tall, and leaned slightly to the left behind a tree. I should mention that we forgot our flashlights and did this whole thing with the lights from our phones. Our light source didn't really go out very far, but we sat there looking at this thing for what felt like an hour. We could see it blink and look around, but it never moved. Occasionally we would get the smell of rotted flesh. At this point we said, screw it, we need to leave. I knew there was an old road not far from where we were heading towards, but we came across what I think was a coyote, a big-ass dog-looking thing, so we debated if we could walk around it. But by the time we decided and realized it, we had become surrounded, and we had 6 of these animals around us in every direction except behind us. In that instant, we looked at each other and pulled out our buck knives, thinking we'd rather die fighting. But the coyotes never approached us, they just stood in front of us. So we suggested we would walk backwards until they left us alone. As we walked backwards, the coyotes followed us. But if we started going to the left or right, they would kind of jump at us. We made it out safely. But looking back now, I kind of feel like the coyotes were guiding us to safety from whatever the thing with red eyes was. But I'm no quitter. Me and my friends will be going to the woods again as soon as I get a weekend off. I need to know what those red eyes were, and I really want to explore that mine. If any of you have any ideas on what the red eyes could be, I'm all ears. This happened to me and my friend Sam 10 winters ago. We liked exploring nature and walking around outside, and our friends had recently introduced us to this beautiful place in Wisconsin, Grant Park, that we had visited with them 3 or 4 times. Every time we had gone, it had been a pleasant trip. We walked around, got to see some beautiful views of Lake Michigan, sat in crooks of trees and spoke about books and games and other things. We had been starting a new game of Hunter, The Darkness, a tabletop RPG game like Dungeons & Dragons, and we were using the park for scenic inspiration. It was great for the purposes of storytelling. She and I are both female. The first time she and I were alone, we went around dusk to take some pictures that we could Photoshop for the game. This park is massive, and there are many bridges, footpaths, and winding roads throughout. We were walking over a bridge that sat against one of the roads with dense woods on either side. As we were crossing, a car drives by and rolls down the window, and some guy leans out and yells, "Hey!" at us. We're both startled and jump, but dismiss them and continue walking across the bridge. Less than a minute later, the same car comes driving back the other direction, and this time the driver's side window rolls down, and the driver, another male, calls out, "Hey ladies, come here." We picked up our pace. The car drives away, and right as we're about to hit the end of the bridge, we see the car come at us again from the original direction. We book it up to the trees and up the hill, and we hear the car stop, and the 2 men begin yelling for us. We continue running and hid in the dark for 15 or so minutes until they left, and we ran back to our car and left as well. You would think we would avoid the park after that, but once we had gotten out of the property and warmed over a hot chocolate from Perkins, we had a good laugh over being so scared. We went back to the park with our male friends a few times, and nothing ever remotely scary happened. So she and I decided to go back, just the 2 of us, again. Sam and I often spent our afternoons and early evenings exploring the outside, hiking, geocaching, and just sitting outside in parks and talking. So we had just decided to add it to our repertoire. We headed back around dusk again, and with the camera to take more pictures, especially since we hadn't gotten the shots we wanted the first time. Now obviously looking back on this, we both feel incredibly foolish having gone back, alone and around the same time and at the same place. But as I had said, we had gone a few more times with our male friends, and even when we had just gone with 1 male with us, nothing had happened, so we thought we were just being skittish. Anyway, we went back when a car rolls by and, as you guessed it, the window rolls down and some guy just yells out some random noise. This time we don't wait for them to drive around, we duck into the woods and start walking back towards the pier. We figured we'd abandon the other photo spot and just explore the pier, take some lake shots, not really what we were there for, but figured if we made it in time for the sunset, which was almost all the way down, we could have some nice snaps over the lake just for fun. The way the pier is set up is that there is a long, thin road from the top of a giant grass hill down and around a curve and into the parking lot. The pier is at the end of the right side of the parking lot, about 200 yards away, and if you walked from near the pier down to the right side of the parking lot, there was a little bridge that led into a development with tennis courts that sat next to the preserve. So we began walking down the road to the lake, when the same car from before drives down into the parking lot by the pier. They didn't say anything as they drove past, but we still decided to slow down and decided whether or not we wanted to continue down by the pier. The car turned around in the parking lot and came back up the road. The car reached where we were stopped, and so we immediately turned and started walking down the hill. All of the windows rolled down, and we saw that there were 4 guys and 1 girl in the car who yelled hello. and Sam and I turned and waved. One of them said, "Oh hey, you're cute," and the others joined in. "Hey, yeah, wait for us." Now, mind you, we're two small females, 5'2" and 5'3" respectively, but we're also super bundled up in large winter coats and hats. You could barely see our faces or our shapes, so they didn't really have a lot to base it on. We'd been ignoring them when we hear someone yell, "We're coming back for you," and they start driving up the hill. Sam and I decided not to take any chances and start running down the hill. We hear hooting and hollering and seeing them disappear over the hill, and we start running towards the bridge that was closest. And once you've gotten off the bridge to the left, there is a concrete deck with a drop-off to a ramp about 5 feet tall, so that if you got off the bridge and jumped right down, you'd be at the bottom of the ramp and couldn't be seen from the other side if you ducked down, which is exactly what we did. We hear the car speed back down the hill, and 4 doors open and close as they all start screaming and laughing. "Come here, girls, we'll be nice, we just want to play." Most of them took off to the pier, but 2 of them stayed behind and we could make up bits and pieces of what they were saying, asking about where they went, and saying that they would find us. Sam and I huddled and freaked out, and once it had been silent near the bridge for a while, we decided to peek out and see if the other 2 guys had left so that we could sneak back up the hill or make a break for it somewhere else. We peek over and there's a guy on the other end of the bridge and he clearly sees us. He screams to his buddies and starts running across the bridge towards us. We take off towards the development, running around the side of the tennis courts while being chased by 3 of the guys. One of them is very near to us, about 30 feet, but the rest of us were catching up faster than we would have liked. We took a quick turn between 2 houses in the subdivision and were lucky to never see them from that point on. We got back to our car by walking through the forest preserve, incredibly slowly, dashing across roads, terrified out of our minds. We left that night and called our friends that we normally went to the preserve with. From then on, they insisted on accompanying us any time we had the bright idea to go out there again. This happened when I was around 13 years old. I had just moved into a small countryside town into a house that was just beside a huge forest. It was a new neighborhood, and there weren't very many houses on my street. You could, without a doubt, walk into the woods and still be going for hours. Being both young and stupid, I take my dog to walk without having my parents with me or anything to protect me. Don't blame my parents. They were reassured by the fact that my dog was big and people were easily frightened by him. My dog was about 7. And I did this often, nothing bad ever happened, and I never met anyone there. I loved it because I could really take my mind off everything that was happening in my life. The move was rough, and people were making fun of me. I really didn't like school. I needed it. So there I was, casually walking on a track that is across the wood, and is often used by people on motorbikes or quads. Then I hear something that I didn't pay too much attention to at first, but then I had to, because the sound became louder. I turn around and I see a person coming straight at me on his motorcycle. I'm a 13-year-old girl who was scared of about everything, so I decide to get off the track as quickly as I can to hide. Unfortunately for me, Henry is a big black dog, so it does not blend in with the surroundings as everything was green and it was the middle of the day. I was walking pretty fast, but could tell that the biker was obviously approaching me quickly. I started running and found a rock that was big enough to hide my dog and I when I heard the vehicle come and go. It was very unlikely the person saw us, and I waited, telling myself that I was being silly. When I thought I'd waited long enough, I started walking again. I froze instantly when I heard the loud engine suddenly getting closer to me. Without hesitation, I started running like hell. When I was able to stop and hide, I did. My dog wasn't in the best of shape, and I was feeling so bad for making him run that much. I could tell he was getting closer and closer to me. It wasn't a very dense forest, so he could easily follow me and was much faster than I was. To make matters worse, I trip on a branch and fall to the ground, But I was so full of adrenaline I just got up and began running again. He was meters from me, so he can see me, and was clearly chasing me. There was no doubt in my mind that if he were to get me, something bad would happen. As we were approaching a more dense part of the forest, the guy had no choice but to stop. It gave me an advantage and I was able to get away. And I was so glad when I saw a house. Even though it was under construction and no one lived in it, I found a hiding spot behind the fence. Not moments later, I saw a person come out to where I'd just been, and I felt a huge surge of relief when they started to leave. I hid for at least 40 minutes without moving to make sure they did not return. I made my way home and told my parents about it. They thought I was being dramatic. In the end, I never knew who this person was, and I hurt myself, but nothing too serious. I heard years later about weed that was being grown in parts of the wood, and cameras that had been set up to protect their crop. Maybe I got too close to some of them and they saw me on the cameras and wanted to give me a fright. Who knows? My older brother and I were searching for firewood when my brother found a weird white circular shape in the ground with a hole in it. It was mostly buried, and he dared me to pull it out of the ground. Obviously I did, and when I pulled it out to the surface it was half a human skull. We were young and didn't recognize it at first until we showed it to my father, who knew exactly what it was. My finger was in the eye socket, which had I known about I would have freaked out. He called the authorities and the FBI were even called to investigate. They had crime tape scenes off everywhere, and my dad knew we weren't supposed to be looking for firewood there, so he was afraid. My whole family was questioned, as it could have been recent. One of the officers said he would keep my dad updated with what they found. Turned out it was a Native American Indian skull. My dad took a picture while we were waiting for the police to show up. We would still have that picture, had I not slipped up being so young and told them my dad took a cool photo and they made him delete it. This happened in Colorado, and it was a Pueblo Indian skull apparently. I have these woods by my house that are quite nice, but also attract some weird people. I've had multiple experiences while I was there, but the strangest by far was when I was biking with a friend on a rainy day. The trail we were on was paved, but set off a ways from the main trail. The ground was damp and muddy, and we were going pretty slow. We biked past an open off-road trail and saw a man about 20 feet from us, holding an axe in a tree stump with his back turned to us and praying under his breath. He had long unkempt hair and a ratty black raincoat on. The whole thing was so eerie that we sped away, but out of curiosity, it brought us back soon after. We turned around after biking in the other direction for about 2 minutes to check on the spot. When we got back there, the man was gone, and there were no footprints in the mud. I live in a very rural area, a small village with maybe 10 to 15 houses, but close to the highway, and also about 10 minutes away from town. If you cross the street, it takes you about a 10-minute walk to reach the forest. First Christmas Day in the afternoon, my partner and I decide to go for a little digestive walk, as we were really stuffed from all the food. It was about 5 and already dark when we left, and we had a big and bright LED flashlight with us. I also took my camera and flash and love taking pictures of nature at night. We decided to walk on a little country road towards the forest and then turn right, following a small, graveled cycle track close to the forest border, which connects our village and the next. In the middle part of the track, you have to walk through a small bit of forest. It's rather dark, and the trees are very high and quite dense. When we entered, I saw our flashlights reflecting on something and recognized a car being parked there on the side of the track, close to the trees. This struck me as odd, as cars are not allowed to drive there and the path is very narrow and hidden, so I was cautious. My partner pointed to the light inside of the car and it appeared to be empty. I also noticed that the windows were frozen, so it must have been parked there a while. A bit in front of the car I spotted a tree with an intriguing structure, and I asked my partner to point the flashlight towards it so that I could photograph it better. After I took a few snaps, my partner told me, there's someone standing behind us in the middle of the road who's looking right at us. Nobody was following us the whole way. I kept looking around and behind us occasionally, because at this time in the evening, and close to the border of the forest, there are boars. And it's mating season, so they're more aggressive than usual. Indeed, there was a man standing behind us, staying out of the flashlight's reach. He wasn't saying anything, just standing there and facing us. At first, I thought he may be startled, as it may seem a bit weird if someone is just taking photos around your car. It was not even legal to drive on that path with the car. I decided to get up and confront him from a distance, explaining to him that I was just taking photos of the tree. He didn't react and stood still. I then went on to ask him if he needed some light, and he replied that it wasn't necessary. It was odd, but I was still calm, sure there was a normal explanation for his behavior. Nonetheless, my partner and I decided to get out and followed the path leading to the next village, which was perhaps 5 minutes away. I remembered the letters on his license plate, not the numbers though, and Googled it. Turned out it was from a city about 6 hours away from ours. Mind you, at the time of this story the country was in very strict lockdown, so you're only allowed to travel, even by car, for an emergency. After we reached the first lantern of the next village, we looked back and observed the car driving a bit out the forest, turning around and going back inside. I was able to see that he parked there again and turned the lights off. He didn't leave the forest. We went home on a much longer way than initially intended, as I didn't want to go back for obvious reasons. Our flashlight battery died on the way, and my phone battery was low, so I didn't want to call the police then, but I called them as soon as I got home and gave them all of the details. My big regret was not memorizing the whole license plate, but it was just so surprising that I seriously didn't think about it. It only occurred to me as really strange when I thought about the frozen windows, and how it was impossible for him to have been walking behind us, plus him having no lights and not replying. He did seem to be sneaking up on us when I sat down to take the pictures. I think I was very lucky to have my partner and the camera and the bright light with me. I don't want to imagine what would have happened if I'd have been out there alone with this strange guy. We went back and found a tape marking on one of the trees, a very small hideout, as well as some cut-off parts of a backpack, which was very bizarre. Who knows? Some of my friends believe he may have been planning a burglary, or worse, stumping a body. I think it's not unlikely that he may have attacked me if he realized I had a potential photo of his car with a legible number plate. When I was younger in the woods near my parents' house, I saw a man with a rifle sitting on an old tree. There's really nothing weird about it. People go hunting all the time in the woods, and I was on the path they used to come back to their cars. By the way, he was holding the rifle while sitting. The way he stood up in panic right as my dog started trotting his way, and the fact that he was clearly crying felt weird on the spot. He waved at me and said something I didn't quite hear, and I passed him saying hello. It took me 25 minutes of walking before I realized I may have interrupted his suicide attempt. I tried going back, but he wasn't there, and I told my parents about it. They called the police, and nothing ever came of it. Maybe I was wrong though. Maybe he wasn't holding the rifle like I remember, and maybe he wasn't really crying. But I'm going to tell you now, it felt really weird. This happened in Wales, It's more of a story of what I didn't see, but still, let me get into it. I was 13 years old and lived in a tiny remote village, and one day my dog escaped through the back garden and went on an adventure by himself. Concerned about getting into a field with livestock, I went around looking for him around the village and remembered there was a patch of woodland up the hill that I'd never been to before. I could imagine the dog would love it there, so I went to check it out. I reached the woods and began to call out the dog's name, hoping he would come bounding out the woods, but no sign. So I went in further. I came to a pretty large clearing and suddenly I felt a little creeped out. I suddenly didn't want to call out for the dog anymore and thought I should be getting home. I left the clearing and began to hurry back the way I came. Only this time I could hear something. There were very clear sounds of footsteps in the dry leaves following behind me, and I mean right behind me, as though someone kept walking close enough for me to touch them. Only there was nothing there. I kept stopping and looking around, and the footsteps would quickly stop as well. My skin was crawling, but I had a strong sense that I shouldn't run, so I forced myself to keep walking calmly, but I was completely terrified. I managed to walk about 10 steps with the mysterious noise keeping pace with me, until my nerve went and broke into a mad run. The worst part is that the moment I ran, I heard a weird high-pitched noise, like a giggle, coming from behind me. I got the hell out of there and never went back. The dumb dog was waiting for me, having made his way home. I'm glad he didn't go into the woods. He might have been dog-napped by the pixies. I was in the woods, within a mile of my house. I was with a family dog and we went off the trail a little. A man dressed in all camo with no pack and a huge knife on his belt, and his arm in a sling came out of the woods. Some of this is normal, but it gave me very bad vibes. My dog, who's usually very kind and timid, began freaking out. The man was explaining to me how he was hiking from one town to the next, which I thought was weird because he was injured and had no pack and wasn't on a trail. He started saying things like the dog must not like him because he had sunglasses on, and that he was hurt, and that if I could show him the way. I said I would be late for dinner if I did, and tried to go around him to the trail, and he blocked me. Just then I heard my mum yell for me. He did too, obviously, and looked scared. I yelled back towards the direction she yelled from, and when I turned around he had disappeared back into the woods. Perhaps it was nothing, maybe, but a normal person who isn't suspicious in any way would probably say goodbye or something, right? I don't know. It gave me bad vibes. I'm glad I had the good old Wooly with me then. My ex lived near Wenatchee, surrounded by trails. We decided to go check out a trail at the end of her road, past a few orchards, leading up a hill through some brush. Well, not even 20 feet in, just past a bush, was a fresh deer kill, guts splayed out. Now that area is well known for cougars and the state is known for serial killers. Either way, the scene felt unsafe seeing how fresh it looked, and we got the hell out of there and found a different trail. I was once on a walk in a nearby forest. I was only a few minutes away from home. I remember when I was about to start leaving the forest, I suddenly felt like something was watching me. I tried to look around, but no one was there. I started to walk away from the forest, but when I saw this black figure just watching me, it didn't look like an actual person. I quickly continued towards the end of the forest, but I felt like the figure was following me. I looked behind me and it was just standing there, and I quickly looked in front and then looked behind me again, but the figure was gone. I thought I was hallucinating it, but I never went into the forest again after that. This story is from 2017. My roommate and I had gotten into witchcraft and wanted to do a spell together. We thought doing a spell on a hike would be a beautiful and lovely way to do a ritual, so we loaded up the dog and left. We started a little late into the day and went into Chautauqua Park in Boulder, Colorado. It was a pretty crowded place and we ran into plenty of people on the way up. You basically follow a trail up the Flatirons and then follow it back down. Our dog Stella was a champ going up, so unafraid and excited. We made it to the top and found a semi-covered spot by rocks and trees. The ritual was simple. We were basically trying to get better mental health and financial assistance. Now I've been practicing for a long time, I realized the whole thing was a bad idea, but at the time it seemed like a nice way to do it. We made a crystal circle, burned the herbs we had pre-grinded and prepared. So we meditate in the circle for a while and reaffirm our goals. Stella is getting antsy because it's dinner time and she has nowhere soft to lay while we do this. This is where we really screw up. We don't close the circle down or our own energy. We just put everything away and feed Stella and start going down. It's then that I realized how late it was. The sun was setting as we started to go down, and while Stella was awesome going up, she was terrified going down. We would have to climb down parts and then pass her down to make it down some parts of the rocks. It was a mess. We were scrapped up from the rocks in her claws, and I was just unsettled. I kept seeing weird white flashes in my peripherals. It kind of looked like an angry face, and I kept seeing it as we got down the rocks and found the gravel path. It freaked me out, but as I was trying to focus on getting back to the car and not get hurt. By the time we were off the rocks and on the gravel path, it was completely pitch black under the trees. I pull my phone out as a flashlight so that we can see the trail. We're kind of panicked. We're both young women who have watched too much true crime, so we just walked in silence trying to focus on getting down the mountain as fast as possible. Then out of complete darkness, a man sort of materialized ahead of us. I use that word intentionally, as he seemed to slowly come into vision like when you turn on a really old TV. He appeared to be in his 20s, white and with brown hair. I looked at his face briefly before looking away in fear. He had no flashlight to guide him, and his feet made no noise on the gravel. The energy rolling off this guy was pissed off and aggressive. I stared at his shoes because I was afraid to make eye contact with an angry man alone on a mountain. Even the dog ignored him, and she is a territorial cattle dog, so that was unusual. He walks past us without making a sound and doesn't look at us and disappeared into the darkness behind us. I thought about trying to get my knife out my backpack, but I realized I didn't know if he turned around because he made no sound on the gravel as we did. Neither of us said anything, but we both started to run. We were almost out when we ran into a group of 3 college students. They were laughing and talking and shuffling on the gravel. They all had their phones out and flashlights. They said hello as we ran by and we kept on going. We made it back to the car and I asked my roommate if she saw him too. She said she did, but she wasn't sure if I had seen him, so she was afraid to ask while we were running. Neither of us can remember his face, and were freaked out by his lack of noise and light. I mean, this guy was walking comfortably up a mountain in complete darkness. Neither of us really wanted to say we saw a ghost, but with a poorly closed circle and 2 very sensitive people, I'm not ruling out a possibility. We got home, and at 10 p.m. went to bed. We woke up and it was like everything we had asked for in the spell was reversed. My roommate's wallet had been stolen out of her car, and $600 had been spent on her debit. We were both depressed and exhausted and struggling getting out of bed. I still can't remember the guy's face, and I'll never forget the way he walked up that trail without a light and without making a sound, and the waves of anger rolling off him as he passed. 5 years ago, me and 7 friends were on a hiking trip in the Austrian Alps. Our goal was Mountain Grossvendiger, which is 3,666 meters above sea level. The trip was great until the weather suddenly changed from sunny to heavy snowstorm. After half hour, I didn't see a thing, and me and my friend Thomas got separated from the others. Heavy snow and lack of air due to strong wind, and at almost zero visibility, I thought this was the end. It was the first time in my life I actually thought I was going to die. Totally exhausted, lost in the middle of a mountain, after another 30 minutes with my friend Thomas, visibility gets better, when I notice one thing. After 260 meters down the hill, 3 black figures start appearing. Tourists, maybe also stopped by the snowstorm. I asked Thomas if he sees them too, and he said he did. They were pretty tall, but that was none of my concern. I asked Thomas if we were going after them because we didn't know if they were our friends. He then looked at me and said, "No, we can't." I asked why, and he just replied, "We must move fast." I was shocked. I didn't understand why he was so scared. Then we saw our friends in the opposite direction. We regrouped and finally, after another hour, came to the hut which was under the mountain. I told them what we saw and they said they didn't see anyone, and when I asked Thomas why he was in such a hurry, he didn't want to talk about it. And up until this day, I still don't know who or what it was that he thought he saw. What occurred a couple of years ago to me may seem nothing out of the ordinary to some folk, but what I felt that day, I have only experienced once before, and it made me feel something I can only describe as primal. My ex-significant other and I booked this amazing homestead for a vacation for 2 days and nights, after reading a lot of very positive reviews online. It was managed by a very charming and hospitable elderly couple. Now this homestead is smack dab in the middle of a huge, sprawling estate, surrounded by coffee plantations on 3 sides, had its own private waterfall, and behind this estate are very large hills, most of which were owned by this couple. The accommodation provided a quaint little cottage nestled between the main homestead where the couple lived, and another larger cottage that was occupied by a couple of tourist families. The 3 buildings are surrounded by a very beautiful tended garden. A narrow path winds in front of 3 buildings and heads towards the hills. Our first day was generally uneventful, as both of us were exhausted from the long drive from the city we lived in, and we just soaked in the hospitality and the amazing views all around us. The next day, we were given the option to head to the waterfall or hike up the hills, and my ex, after a lot of debate, chose the hills. So a little after 10 a.m, we packed ourselves a nice little brunch and headed out towards the path that led to the hills. The weather was cool, and a light bit of rain had kicked up the smell of damp soil that was invigorating the soul to us city folk. As we reached the end of this winding path, we were faced with hiking up a pretty steep climb directly up the hill or walk towards a now unpaved path that skirted along the hill. Since the rain had left the soil all around us very damp and the grass was wet and slippy, we figured we could find a more gradual climbing spot if we skirted around the hill. So we went off down the unpaved path, and about 10 minutes into the walk the terrain changed dramatically. Instead of open land, we were now walking basically into a ravine, and the trees on both sides of the ravine blotted out the sunlight to a great extent. It was as if we were in the middle of a jungle all of a sudden, but unfazed we remained trekking, in the hopes to find another way to climb the hill, which wasn't visible anymore due to the terrain. After about an hour's worth of navigating through the ravine, we found that the path veered off into even more dense jungle terrain on the left, and on the right was a dilapidated old wooden hut that seemed long vacated. So as we took a breather to try and figure out what to do next, we were met with the angry barking of what I assumed were not less than 8 or 7 dogs, and they were getting closer. So we beat a hasty retreat back the way we came. Once the barking subsided, we regained our composure, only to find tons of leeches trying to get on us from the wet bushes and blades of grass. This freaked out my ex, and I had to run through the boulder-filled ravine to basically catch her up. We ended up back at the steep spot of the hill, and by this point I'd had enough, but gave in to persuasion and ended up climbing the steep part of the hill on all fours, getting dirt and grass all over me. To my relief, the steep bit gave way to what I can only describe as a meadow of lush green grass, bordered on the left by bushes with sweet-smelling wild flowers, and on the right an unobstructed view of gentle rolling meadows that actually had cattle grazing, but I did not find anyone herding the cattle. So an hour and a half later of hiking through the meadow, we chanced upon a muddy path carved into a much gentler sloping hill. Now this hill was huge, but the path made the climb much more forgiving. Upon cresting the hill, the other side of the crest was a sheer drop. We rested and tucked in the food we had brought, all the while admiring the view. It was 2 p.m. now. The crest of the hill was so high up that every time a cloud passed through, it drizzled on us for a few minutes and we were then greeted by sun. This was heaven to a couple of city folks. By 5 p.m. I was starting to get antsy and wanted to negotiate our way back down, as I didn't want to slip on the wet grass and I sure as heck didn't want to try my luck climbing down in the dark. After about a half hour of begging and pleading with a reluctant ex, I finally managed to drag her back off the crest and start our climb down. The first thing I noticed was absolute silence. We were losing light faster than we could climb, and the silence was really getting to me. I looked around to see if the cattle were grazing, but no. They were gone. Everything was deserted, there was no sound, and it was at that point that I felt like I was being watched from behind. My ex was behind me while we climbed, so I asked her to go on ahead of me and I would bring up the rear. In my mind, I wanted to put myself between her and any person that would meet us from behind, but a few minutes later I get the same feeling of being watched, not only from behind me but from all around us except the front. All the hair on my forearms were upright. I was hypervigilant, almost bordering on panic. My ex didn't feel anything, but was starting to get creeped out from my behavior. Up until that moment I had been cheerful, joking, and muttering everything I could. But I was now unnaturally quiet, as per her observation, and extremely focused on getting off the hill. At the same time, I was looking all around searching for someone, as per her observation, and extremely focused about getting off the hill, while also looking around to make sure I didn't see anyone that I knew was around. Before the silence and sense of being watched hit me, all my mind was preoccupied with was to not slip and to look out for snakes. But now, that was not a concern. I urged her down faster, but didn't tell her anything as to not panic her, and partly to not seem like a blithering idiot in my mind. I was ready to slip and slide down the hill if it meant a faster way down, but I didn't want to leave her behind. After about half hour of torment, a new feeling crept over me. A feeling of anger from whatever or whoever was watching us, like we were not meant to be there, like we were trespassing. Then, as if by some kind of miracle, a dog appeared behind me. I hadn't seen this fellow when we climbed up. He was a thin, emaciated brown mongrel who had his tail tucked between his legs and looked at us warily, all the while following us at a distance. Although the sight of the dog put me a bit at ease, the feeling of being watched lingered on. Since I also didn't want to be bitten by the dog, I made the ex stop and give way to see if the dog would pass us by, and he did. He crept closer to us and wagged his tail while looking at both of us and passed us by, but was still a bit wary. And then the most curious thing happened. He would climb down a bit and wait until we reached him, and would repeat this over and over until we hit the bottom of the hill. It was like he was escorting us to safety. I felt a slight bit at ease at last, now focused on the dog and desperately trying to ignore the still lingering menacing feeling that was now behind me. I finally realized that we were now climbing down in the dark, and by the time we managed to get back on the paved path it was 8 p.m. and pitch black. We were walking behind the dog, who was now wagging his tail and walking closer to us. Much to my relief, I could at last see lights in the distance. The dog escorted us all the way to our cottage, and while I was trying to find some food for him, he disappeared. Only when we got off the hill did that feeling of being watched dissipate. It was as if someone flipped on a switch, and the sounds of insects were instantly all around us. I swore to myself to never put myself in that situation if I could help it. When we met our hosts for dinner, they said that they were actually worried as we were expected back by 4 p.m. and were trying to reach us on our phones, which had no network coverage throughout this whole ordeal. I didn't want to tell them about this horrendous experience, but inquired about the brown dog and if he was theirs. They told me he was a stray and was known to escort past visitors up the cottage and then vanish. He was nothing short of a miracle, a divine presence who guided us to safety. This happened to me when I was solo camping at the Lake Dubonnet campsite west of the lake near Interlaken. In the morning I set off for a hike around nearby Lost Lake. Fitting name, right? I realized after a short while as I neared Lost Lake that the forest nearby was absolutely silent and without a sound. No birds, not a squirrel, nothing. I felt like I had entered a sort of dream state, thinking, am I dreaming this? Why is the forest silent? As I kept walking, I started to hear the sound of what I thought was a helicopter coming nearer. I was confused by that, but there is a Great Lake Maritime Academy in Traverse City. So I theorized that perhaps a helicopter was flying back to town. By that time, I'd previously lived in Interlaken for 2 years and had never heard such a sound, but your mind tries to make sense of things. I kept walking and the sound continued to come nearer and then became deafening, as though it was buzzing in my ear. At that same point, I then felt as though I could see behind me, and that perhaps a bear was going to run up and charge me from behind and tackle me. At this point, the helicopter noise was super loud and I panicked, whipped around, and there was nothing there. The noise then stopped instantly. And I felt like I had just woken up. I shook my head, super confused, looked all around me and looked to the sky for a plane or anything, but there was truly nothing. I was beyond perplexed, of course. I wanted to go back to my tent and car ASAP, but I did not want to turn around and walk past Lost Lake any more than I had to. So I kept going on the trail, which thankfully was circular enough to get me back to the campsite. I never experienced that again either, in that exact spot or anywhere else. I guess I'll forever be puzzled, but would love to hear if anyone else has ever felt anything like that. I'd love to hear what you have to say. I was hiking with Boy Scouts. We went out to a part of the region that was supposed to have been untouched by people. Well, about 60 miles in, we find a gravestone. But that is not the creepy part. The creepy part is that there were candles still lit, and some articles of children's clothes laying next to it. We did a death march, running with your pack, out of there, as you can imagine. Hey guys, it's Mort here. Thank you so very much for listening. Thank you for joining me in tonight's video in the woods. I always do like a nice walk in the woods. If you did enjoy tonight's content, be sure to let me know by dropping a like, leaving a comment, and such. It really does mean the world to me. I should have a new video for you on Friday, but on what exactly I still don't know. Perhaps we'll have another poll to see what you guys decide. Seriously though, I hope everyone is really well. And yeah, more videos coming soon. If there's something else you'd like to see, I've got some suggestions here on screen. But until then, I'd like to give a farewell by giving a thank you to my lovely members and patrons. You guys are the best. But until then, stay awesome, and I'll see you in the next one.